Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for that introduction. Thanks, Olivia, especially for the introduction and the invitation. It's great to be here. As Olivia mentioned right at the beginning, more and more team sport athletes are using altitude training. In Australia, in the Australian Football League, approximately half of the teams are using altitude training currently, or have in the current pre-season. So they're spending, some teams up to hundreds of thousands of dollars on altitude training. But as Olivia also mentioned, to date, there's actually no published evidence showing improved team sport performance following altitude training. Now, I think during this conference, we may hear of some recent research, but there's actually no published evidence. So the question is, is there a reason for athletes to spend $100,000 or more on altitude training in spite of this lack of evidence? What I'm going to do today to try and set the scene is to, given this lack of evidence, is to talk about some of the determinants of team sport performance and whether or not some of these factors could be potentially improved by altitude training, and also hopefully give some insights into some of the factors we might need to consider measuring when we're doing altitude studies. I have to also point out this is a snapshot, and so I'm looking around and there's an audience full of experts, so I apologise in advance if I don't publish, if I don't refer to some of your excellent research. Where I want to start is just, and this was also mentioned right at the beginning, okay, so as we all know, I mean, football is obviously a skilled sport, and it doesn't, putting the fittest person on the field, the strongest person on the field, if they don't have the football skills, they're probably not going to be able to do what we've just seen there. So what I'm going to concentrate on is the physical determinants of team sport performance, but obviously the technical side is very important. This may be a little bit simplistic, but what I've tried to do is to separate some of what I consider the more important physical determinants of team sport performance. And basically I've separated into two. So sprint performance and recovery between the sprints and the or high intensity efforts. And going through the various factors I hope you can read there. So sprint performance determined by stride length and stride frequency and determined by these other factors here. And there's also strength and power in here and elastic strength, so that will help with acceleration and jumping, etc. What I'll do first, though, is just concentrate on the sprint performance. And if we think about it, we know that, I think if we look at it, we know just by looking at a game that, and this is a selection from a bunch of different sports, that AFL players, so Australian football players in Australia, they can accelerate maximally up to 150 times in a match. We've done field hockey studies. They perform up to 50 sprints and up to 100 high-intensity runs during a match. And football players can perform up to 250 high-intensity efforts during a match. So that would suggest that sprinting is important for football performance. But what's quite interesting is that there's actually little evidence that sprint ability is an important determinant. So it's difficult to actually find a study that's shown if you improve sprint performance, you'll actually improve match performance during football. Nonetheless, I think we can I think, make a fairly safe assumption that sprint ability is important. And it's been suggested by some New Zealand researchers that approximately 1% impairment in sprint speed would have a substantial detrimental effect on the likelihood of getting to the ball before another player. And some of the research we've shown with the Italian group is shown that total sprint distance during a professional soccer match is correlated with mean sprint speed during an RSA test, a repeated sprint ability test. So again, I think there's some good suggestion that if we can improve sprint ability, we can also improve football match performance. But if we go to altitude, what evidence is there that altitude training can affect sprint performance? One of the determinants I mentioned previously was ATP, energy supply. As usual, the evidence is pretty mixed. So there's some studies showing an increase in estimated anaerobic capacity after 15 days of live high, train low, And there's other studies that have shown no changes in glycolytic enzyme activity after 3 weeks of live high, train low. And some studies showing greater Wingate test performance as, I guess, an indirect measure of anaerobic capacity. So it's a little bit of evidence, again, conflicting, and you'll probably hear me say after almost every slide we need more research, but there's some hope that we may get improvement in anaerobic capacity. If we look at some of the other factors which in particular determine stride length, we have power and strength. And so is there any evidence if we go up to altitude that we can improve these factors? Some really interesting, I think, emerging evidence, especially coming out of Japan, that doing strength and power training in hypoxic conditions can get greater improvements in strength and hypertrophy. So in this study here on the left, in the light blue was doing training in normoxia, and in the dark blue was training in hypoxia. And you can see here, after 6 weeks, the group that trained in hypoxia had a significantly greater improvement in arm curl strength. So perhaps training at altitude, we may be able to get an advantage for strength and power, which may help to improve stride length and sprint ability. The other important determinant of sprinting is also stride frequency. And as Olivier mentioned, when the Mexico Olympics alerted us to this, that all the sprint records were broken, and Bob Beamon set the long jump record by 45 centimetres, which I think took more than 20 years to break again. So with the low, that shows that we can have increased velocity at altitude, and with the decrease in the air resistance, we can get improvements in velocity. So that may allow athletes to do overspeed training, which will help to improve their stride frequency and will help to improve their sprint performance. But very little evidence I don't know if I've seen any studies actually looking at that. Interestingly, we've also recently with Francois, we've had a look at just living high, so 19 days of staying at 3,200 metres. And what we've seen is that after 19 days, we get a smaller decrease, so this is the pre-value and this is the post-value of brain oxygenation values. So we get a smaller reduction in brain oxygenation after 19 days of living at altitude. So that may help to improve coordination, etc., which would obviously be a benefit for sprinting. And there have been some studies showing improved sprint performance when you come back to sea level after altitude training. So it may be that a combination of all these factors is contributing to those small improvements in sprint performance. So the other side of the equation is the recovery between sprints. And again, hopefully it's not too simplistic, but what I've put here, recovery being largely determined by phosphocreatine resynthesis, VO2 max, and muscle buffer capacity. And in particular, some of the components of VO2 max, so the cardiac output, AVO2 difference, etc., and I'll elaborate on those. So the first thing is trying to understand the energy contribution to sprint and repeated sprint. So we've done a number of studies, as have others, taking muscle biopsies, also measuring oxygen consumption before, during, after sprints. And from that, this here, especially from the work, some of the good work of Bogdanis, you can see the contribution to doing a single 6-second sprint. So there's a small contribution from stored ATP, a very small, around about 6% aerobic contribution, and then a larger contribution, the majority is coming from phosphocreatine resynthesis and anaerobic glycolysis. So I guess given that there's a 6% contribution from aerobic, is there any evidence that the aerobic contribution could help to determine football performance? And we've done, and as have others here, what's interesting is that even though the aerobic contribution is very small for a single sprint, as I said, around about 6%, as you repeat sprints, you get a much larger aerobic contribution, such that after only 5 sprints, the aerobic contribution is around about 40%, and athletes can also reach VO2 max in as little as 6 seconds during repeated sprints. And we've shown that if we separate athletes into a moderate VO2 max and a low VO2 max, that we start to get better repeated sprint performance. if we look at some of the correlation studies, we've also shown a correlation between VO2 max and fatigue during a repeated sprint test, so showing that athletes who had a greater VO2 max had less fatigue. But again, this is laboratory testing. If we look at actual football match performance or physical performance, I guess the evidence is a little bit less strong. In fact, this is a study from Peter Krustrup and Bangsbo's group, and they found no correlation between total distance covered during a football match and VO2 max. But it needs to be pointed out that in this they've collated all of the players on a field. So you could have had a player with a high VO2 max who was a fullback, for example, and wasn't doing much running on the field. So we need a better way of looking at this, but taken together, I think most people would probably agree that to a certain point, having a well-developed aerobic system should be, in particular VO2 max, should be a benefit to team sport athletes. So again, this is where I guess most of the research has been done. If we go up to altitude, what sort of effects do we see? So VO2 max, the Fick equation, depends on the cardiac output and the AVO2 difference. And if we separate those out, there's some good evidence, well, there's a few studies looking at cardiovascular changes. Typically, there's no change in heart rate max when training at altitude, following a live high, train low compared to sea level training. And typically, it's difficult to say typically because there's not that many studies, but quite often there's reports of a decrease in the stroke volume. Okay, so that would suggest, obviously, putting together that there's a decrease in cardiac output and a decrease in blood flow. And if there's no other changes, that would also be a decrease in oxygen transport to the muscles. So if we go in deeper and look at the other half of the equation, the AVO2 difference, so it depends on the content of oxygen in the veins and the content in the arteries, and particularly the content in the arteries, largely determined by hemoglobin mass, and the content in the veins by capillarization and oxidative capacity. So again, typically, one study, and a couple of others actually, have shown a pretty good increase in the AVO2 difference with live high, train low compared to sea level training. This mostly gets attributed to changes in red blood cell mass. And this is some study using diabetic patients, dialysis patients, etc., and showing a pretty good correlation between total hemoglobin mass and VO2 max. And I guess research with EPO and as well as blood doping attests to if you can improve the hemoglobin mass, you should have good improvements in VO2 max. This is, though, again, an area where there's very little consensus, with some studies showing good improvements in hemoglobin mass with altitude training and other studies showing very little change. If we go to the other side of the equation and we look at the mitochondria, again, so increasing the mitochondria should increase the extraction of oxygen from the blood to the muscles. And this is an area where I've been doing a reasonable amount of work recently, and another area where there's a lot of controversy with altitude training. Some of the early studies showing improvement in oxidative enzymes with altitude training. Since then, a lot of studies, or a group, especially from the one group, showing decreases in oxidative capacity as evidenced by representative enzymes, and also decreases in mitochondrial volume. But should we point out that typically these studies were very high altitude, so quite often 5,500 meters, and even higher. More recently is a study showing no change in mitochondrial volume. And I guess the thing to point out is all of these markers, I guess, are somewhat indirect markers of the function of the mitochondria. If we look at mitochondrial function, a nice recent study from Carsten Lundby's group showing, I don't know if you can see here, the laser's gone on me, but the blue dot, so the graph on the left, is before the altitude training, and the light blue dots is after the altitude training. So they found I think about a 30% decrease in mitochondrial respiration following their stay at altitude. There's since been that study I showed before, Levitt, showing no change in mitochondrial respiration following 9 days at altitude. And we're still some pilot data from our study, but we actually see the opposite result. in this particular study, we controlled physical activity and make sure that it's the same before going to altitude and while living in the altitude chamber. And after 19 days of living at just over 3,000 metres, we actually see an increase in mitochondrial respiration. So an area of a lot of controversy, and I think one that we need more research to look at. If we look at capillarization, so typically there's no change in capillarization. There may be, if there's atrophy of the muscle fibres, there may be an increase in number of capillaries per fibre, but the actual number of capillaries so far hasn't been reported to change. And I guess if we look at some of the mechanisms, I guess this result's pretty interesting because, and this is where the theory would suggest that hypoxia stimulates both, it prevents the breakdown of HIF-1 alpha, which should stimulate angiogenesis and an increase in the number of capillaries, and on the other side stimulates PGC1 alpha, which should lead to an increase in mitochondrial biogenesis and fibre type switching, so going from faster to slow twitch fibres. So again, another area which I think we need more research to try and understand the mechanisms by which altitude may cause these physiological adaptations. And as will probably be mentioned by some of the other speakers, I guess one of the problems is there's a large variability in the research. So we've got different altitudes, different doses, different times at altitude, and that makes it difficult to get a consensus because maybe as soon as you change one of these variables, then maybe you see a different result. So until we can solve some of those, the dose issue, it's going to be difficult to get precise answers here. And I'll just go back to here. So that was looking at the aerobic contribution. Where there's probably stronger evidence is, as you can see here, the major energetic component to a sprint is phosphocreatine breakdown. So that would suggest that to be able to do a second sprint or a third sprint, we need to be able to resynthesize our phosphocreatine stores. And with the anaerobic glycolysis also being a large component, to be able to do subsequent sprints, we'll need to remove the hydrogen ions that are produced with anaerobic glycolysis. Both of those factors, I think there's reasonable evidence. So we've done some work in this area showing a good correlation between muscle buffer capacity and repeated sprintability. So if you can improve muscle buffer capacity, you should be able to improve repeated sprintability. And we've shown this, I guess, experimentally in that when we gave sodium bicarbonate to boost blood buffer capacity, it's difficult to see on this graph, but we tend to see an improvement in sprint performance during a laboratory test that simulated a football match. If we go down to creatine, again, some good evidence. This is from David Preen from Western Australia, showing that when they gave creatine compared to a placebo, they saw a much greater, this is repeated sprint performance in sets 2 to 4, 5 to 7, and 8 to 10, and this is the total. So you can see quite a large difference in repeated sprintability when the players are supplemented with creatine. So that again suggests that phosphocreatine resynthesis is important, and if you're able to improve phosphocreatine resynthesis, we should be able to improve repeated sprint performance and possibly also match performance during a football match. So again, as I've done before, what happens when we go up to altitude? If we look at just the muscle buffer capacity, fairly mixed results. The studies to date, there's a group of studies here, so 2 of them from Mitsuno, showing a fairly small increase, around about 5 to 6% improvement in muscle buffer capacity after a stay at altitude. A study from Sally Clark showing no change in muscle buffer capacity after live high, train low. And then, interestingly, a study from Chris Gore, who's also on the Clark paper, using almost the identical live high, train low program, but getting quite a nice 15% improvement in muscle buffer capacity. So some evidence that altitude training may improve muscle buffer capacity. But I guess it should also be pointed out, this is one of our studies, all of the changes to date have all been less than what we're able to achieve by sea-level training and high-intensity training. So to date, it doesn't appear that altitude training can be a superior type of training for improving muscle buffer capacity. And if we look at the creatine side, phosphocreatine resynthesis, I actually haven't seen any research that's looked at the effect of altitude training on phosphocreatine resynthesis. But what we do know is that there's a good correlation between the lactate threshold and phosphocreatine resynthesis. And we've also shown a good correlation, this is unpublished data, between mitochondrial respiration and the lactate threshold. So that would suggest that if we are able to get mitochondrial adaptations from the altitude training, we should be able to improve phosphocreatine resynthesis and improve physical performance during a football match. But again, lots more research to do there. And I guess finally, one of the final pieces in the puzzle, and I'm sure some people talk about it, is the individual response to altitude training. And it seems to be that some people in your group will get quite significant improvements in both hematological parameters and performance, whereas others almost get no change or may even go backwards. So some of the research that we're interested in doing in our laboratory at the moment is trying to identify if there's any particular genetic profiles in athletes which may predispose them to getting better training adaptations. So can, with a simple blood test, we identify those who are most likely to get adaptations from altitude training or most likely to get adaptations from any other training. So just to finish up, so lots of potential factors that altitude training could improve, which could improve team sport performance. But as I said, there's actually no research showing that altitude training can improve team sport performance. But hopefully what I've presented there is a lot of avenues with research that we can look at to try and get a better handle on this project, on this topic. So just to finish, I just wanted to thank a bunch of people. So a heap of people that have been working for many years from Qatar, especially Olivier for organising the symposium today and for inviting me here. Colleagues in Australia who we've been working with as well, so thanks to those guys. Thanks to my PhD students for all the work they've done. And mostly thanks to my family for helping me to forget about work every now and again. And thanks to everyone for listening today.